Okay, to finish up our coverage of the hero image site, I want to just go through the style sheet. So you've already got it in, you've seen it. Let me close that. We're going to talk about what each part of the style sheet is doing and how it relates to the document itself. So the body, we've gotten rid of the margins. By default, there may be a slim margin around the sides of a browser window. If we don't want that, and when we're running a big image across the whole screen, often we don't, we set the body margin to 0. We've got our wrapper set to 100%. So in that case, we're really not doing much with the wrapper in this example. We just get used to having it there, so we're putting it there. We've got our header. We've set its position to relative. This is kind of important because when we absolutely position things, their container, the box they're in this case our H1 for instance, is inside the header, and we can see that down here. There's the header. It has the image and the headline inside of it. I've set the H1 to absolute. So for that to work, the parent element, the container, needs to have a explicit position setting. If we don't, this absolute will refer to the browser window, not to the header. And in this case, that's we want it to be relative to or absolutely positioned inside of the header. Here I've set the top position to something called VW. This is a new addition to CSS, and it stands for view width. And it's basically kind of the width of the window. And so this 3 is it's 3%. So it's a small amount, but it's 3% of the browser window. And so I've also set a margin. So these numbers are going to change. Well, the numbers won't, but the value of these numbers, what they mean, will change as we resize the window. So it's kind of like a percentage. It's 3% of the current window size. If I resize the window, that number is going to go down because 3% of 1,000 is different than 3% of 800, etc. Notice I've also set my font size to VW. This is probably the biggest change in how this particular value works in terms of our web specifications. When we did percentages, the font size would not be affected by percentages. I couldn't do a font size of 8%. It would just ignore it. But with this newly added view width measurement, we can do that. So this means that as I resize the window, the size of my type is changing. And you can see that when you preview actually just preview it. And I have to be in the HTML to preview. I'm sure we've all done that a million times. All right, so there's my H1, that's the headline. I resize, and you can see the type gets smaller. So it's scaling with this width. And again, if we didn't have the body margin at 0, there might be a little white sliver along the edge of that. But all right. So I've set my font family for the headline to Helvetica, and second choice is sans serif. Color I set to dark red. It kind of matched the cherry. So hashtag hero is the ID that I've given the image. So in my styling, I've set its width to 100%, which means it will resize with its container, and its container is the header. By default, the width of a div is 100%. The header is like a div, any block element, so I don't have to explicitly put that in there, but that's kind of implied. I've set the height to auto, and that's going to keep it proportional when it reads the picture inside of it. And then I've styled the article. So article is a recent addition to the HTML tag system, and the idea a few years ago was to make more, I don't know, descriptive tags rather than just generic things like divs. So article is supposed to be like an article. It still just makes a box, so it's not a huge difference. It just sometimes makes our code a little more meaningful. I'd look at it and say, oh, that's an article, and I could have several articles on a page if I'm thinking more like a newspaper, newsletter kind of thing. So just to gain some familiarity with these different tags that we can use, we put some in. So we've set our margin to 0 and auto. That's going to essentially center it inside of its container, given a font family of Garamond and serif, so if the Garamond's on your computer, it will use it. Let's set the width to 80%, so it will be narrower than the picture above it, our hero image, which is 100%. And that's to get that to center, I use the margin. So 0 refers to the top and bottom, and auto refers to the left and right, and the net effect is to center. I've given it a max width, so max hyphen width of 950 pixels. So if you make your window really big, the article box will stop growing wider when it reaches 950 pixels. This keeps me from getting really long lines of type that are just harder to read and awkward. So H2 inside of the article, this is where I'm using the Google font. So we, in the head of our document, we created a link to that font based on the information provided from Google when we went and selected the typeface. Then to actually use it, also on the Google instructions, it told us to assign the font family to this name, which is the name of the font. It needs to be in quotes, single or double, but because it's got a space in it. If you have a font name like Garamond that does not have a space in the name, you don't need quotes around it. But if you have a space in the name like Times Space Roman, then you need to put quotes around it. Cursive, again, is a default, saying if you don't have Carter 1, use some kind of script-like or cursive font, just like serif is Garamond, and up here we did sans serif for Helvetica. And this is a kind of a weird exception. Well, not a weird exception, but sans serif has a hyphen. That's okay. It's not a space. If it had a space in it, we would need quotes around it, but we don't. All right, so I've also set this headline to be responsive to the width. So I've set the font size to 4.4 VW. And I set the line height, which is equivalent to leading, to 4.4 VW as well. And in this case, my headline should stay on one line, but just in case it doesn't, I want to keep the line spacing close to the font size. I've also set my margins for the headline. So this is the margin above. If I do 4 values, right, it's top, right, bottom, left. So it's clockwise starting at the top. So this just means that as you resize the window, I'm adjusting both the size of the type of the headline and the space above and below it. For this, I've set the color with RGB values. We'll do a video soon just about color and all the different ways we can set color. But just for this example, I thought I would show an RGB. In RGB, so I type RGB, I give it a value for the red, a value for the green, and a value for the blue. And we'll look at this in the context of, say, Photoshop or Illustrator, where you can set colors in these ways. So it's an alternative to, say, dark orange, where I put in a word. There's about I don't know, 120 words that are defined that you can use, but if you don't remember all of them, some of them will show up when we type things in. It'll let us pick a color. Right? So if I do As soon as I hit the colon, these things pop up. So these are some of the choices. There are more, but so dark orange. And remember that it doesn't put the semicolon at the end. So when you're doing that, always remember to put the semicolon. Space here doesn't really matter, but I'll be consistent, put my spaces in since I've done that on everything else. All right, so now I'm styling the paragraphs inside of the article. So I'm giving them a margin of 0, and I've given them a text indent of 2 ems. So this is going to indent the start of each paragraph, which is a more common way of doing it in, say, in word processing or books, novels, etc., instead of the default method of indicating paragraphs, which is to put space between the paragraphs. So by setting the margin to 0, we eliminate that idea of space between the paragraphs, and we're saying we're going to do an indent. An EM, is a typographic measurement, and it's based on the point size of the type. And it's basically a unit that is the same as whatever the current point size is. So 14 points is my font size. That means 2 ems will be 28 points. If this was 10 points, 2 ems would be 20 points. So it's again kind of a relative thing that changes based on the size of the type. And then I've got my line height, which in typography we call leading. It's the space between lines. It's actually the space in computer systems between the baseline of a line of type and the baseline of the next line of type down. The baseline is simply the kind of imaginary line that the type sits on top of. And so I've also set a class called noIndent, where I can use this to turn off the text indent on a particular paragraph, and we'll see I did that in the one of my paragraphs. I've also made this style paragraph, and this is I wanted to style the first paragraph a little differently. I wanted to make the type a little bigger and give it a color. And I can use this is called a pseudo selector. It's kind of like a filter. So we're saying, all right, we're going to do something to a paragraph, but we only want to do it to a paragraph that is the first of its type. And we'll kind of see what that means in our styles here. And the reason this paragraph is kind of the first of its type, it's the first paragraph that has a class noIndent. There's lots of different ways we can make it the first of its type. It's the first paragraph also, so there's several ways that it kind of fills this criteria. So this paragraph, for instance, is not the first paragraph, so it doesn't get styled. So Firebrick, I've changed the color and the font size and the line height, again with the leading. I put my footer at the bottom. I've given her the height. Again, I used RGB for the background color, and I tried to put in numbers that made a color that kind of matched the blue sky in my photo at the top of the page. And I've given a margin. Again, margin is the space outside of things or between things. Padding adds space inside of the thing. So the footer, when I add padding, the footer gets bigger. When I do a margin, the distance between the footer and the things above it gets increased. Then I've styled the paragraph inside of the footer. And again, I've given a font, text align, font style. And I set the anchor tag, and anchors are links. And by default, an anchor gets blue, it turns blue, and it gets an underline. If I don't want the underline, I set the text decoration to none, so that gets rid of the underline. In this case, I want it to be white, so it reverses out of the blue rather than the default dark blue, which would be hard to read, and so I've just changed the color. All right, last thing is this idea of a media query. And we'll talk about this more in a future lesson, but just wanted to introduce the idea here. And what this does, it allows us to change styling based on certain criteria. In this case, it's based on the width of the browser window. So media, I do at, that's a little at sign, which is what? The shift of 2, at media, and then I have the word screen. You could also put all in there, and again, we'll talk about that more when we do a thing just on media queries. Then the word and then in parentheses, I'm giving it my condition. Max width of 600. So when my browser window gets to be less than 600, I'm going to change my styles a little bit. Just so I can back that up. Okay. And what this does, it will override previous styles that I've declared for things. So for instance, when I make the window smaller, I'm going to set my header H1 to a different font size. So it's 10 VW, before it was 8 VW. So I'm just making it a little bit bigger. I'm setting my H2, my article headline, to a specific size rather than using VW values. And I'm changing the line height as well. And I'm also adjusting the size of the type in my first paragraph. And if you notice what that actually does in terms of behavior, it's not a big difference, but just so you can see what happens. So there's my headline. If I go really big, it's kind of filling up the whole line. It got bigger again. Move that back down. And as I move it down, it's getting smaller, 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 smaller. And at that point, when I hit 600, notice it gets bigger again. And the type here changes a little bit, and this changes a little bit too. So again, a pretty subtle difference. But when I hit that point, I'm starting to get to a point where my headline is not as important as it feels like visually it should be, and this text is starting to look a little big compared to the other things on the screen. So I've just tweaked that so it I end up with what I hope is a better looking screen. All right, so still a fairly simple, clean page, but lots of little subtle details to think about in terms of the styling. And again, some of these specific things we'll deal with in the future in more detail, specifically the media queries and some of these newer measurements like the view width and things. All right, let's stop it.